Hi, all. Thank you for joining this Blackbird.AI LinkedIn Live. My name is Dan Patterson, and today we are talking about the RAV3N Report 2026 State of Disinformation Narrative Intelligence with Blackbird.AI CEO Wasim Khaled. Wasim, thank you for joining us today. Let's start with the basics. What is disinformation narrative intelligence, and how has AI changed the nature of disinformation narrative intelligence in 2026?
All right. Yeah, great to be talking to you, Dan. Disinformation narrative intelligence. So, this has evolved quite a bit since Blackbird started working on the problem. I think one of the ways to think about this, just like zooming out a little bit, is that overall AI in the last few years in particular has really industrialized influence. And so when we talk about disinformation, narrative intelligence, the thing that we really focus on primarily are narrative attacks. And the way we think about narrative attacks is these automated systems or tradecraft that can drive and amplify narratives at machine speed to influence perception. It can change perceptions about people, brands, products, policies. It doesn't really matter. The key here is these technologies being used by opportunistic threat actors to change the narrative and often create massive financial, reputational, or even physical harm. And as far as like how AI has changed the game, especially going into this year and forward, I think the biggest thing is the compression of time and cost to run a narrative attack. A single operator can now launch campaigns that once required massive coordination or teams and infrastructure and money. Generative AI and tools, agents have transformed these threats into automated campaigns that can be launched in a very short period of time, and they can run contextually accurate in different regions of the world. So really, narrative intelligence is the practice of being able to see the underlying tradecraft and signals to help operators and strategists really operate in a world where reality is getting further and further warped every day.
So, one thing I think about pretty often, and I know that you do as well, is how business leaders are responding. Increasingly, they view disinformation narrative intelligence as a security threat, not just a PR or comms problem. Why is that?
Mhm. Yeah, I think originally PR and comms professionals were the ones who lived in narrative. They were always trying to understand why people were saying the things they say and what to do about it. I think security and cybersecurity, threat intelligence in particular, has increased in their need for this. One, because like the damage is now very obvious that narrative attacks are often perpetrated by the same types of threat actors that they've dealt with in the cyber realm for quite some time. So these types of people who are essentially hacking human perception, they're often sitting like swivel chair with the people who are running traditional malware attacks, ransomware attacks, and network intrusions, exfiltration. And so, who ends up being the best suited to actually engage with those types of adversaries? Not the comms teams, but rather the ones who are used to dealing with those kinds of actors. Not to say that the comms team don't have a critical role, because once something happens from like a cyber breach perspective, you still need to clean up the narrative in the information space and the media space. And so one of the things that we've seen is hybrid fusion centers forming between the threat intelligence teams and the crisis comms teams. And some of the statistics in our report where we surveyed all these different professionals, I believe like almost 60% of organizations report that they've already been impacted by narrative attacks, which is probably a lot higher than most people would think. Detection capability across the board is weak. And that gap is why this has moved from communications to also the CISO and often the CEO, the C-suite, and the board. Because some of the problems that narrative attacks can cause are actually the things that keep them up at night. Often they just don't realize that there are companies like Blackbird or technologies in the space of narrative intelligence that can address those large scale problems.
This is kind of a cat and mouse game, and the phenomenon is evolving very quickly. So, what makes disinformation narrative intelligence campaigns harder to detect than these earlier forms of misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah. You know, we were talking about comms a moment ago, and so typically the way to understand what's happening in the kind of the online digital space was like media monitoring, like social media monitoring. And so you looked at things like keywords. and you looked at topics, and maybe you looked at sentiment. You looked at those over time, and that's how you can make major decisions. What's trending? How do people feel about it? Positive, negative. Problem is that's so easy to inundate and that system to make the operators who are looking at that data think something is happening when it's not. And all I need to do, or anybody needs to do, is spin up an army of agents to go talk about a particular company 100,000 times over, and those old tools are going to think something is happening in that area. And it's really the adversary potentially making you want to look in that direction when they're trying to do something else over here. And so it's harder because the tools make it seem more and more like real conversations that are happening online. It started with bot networks, evolved into agents, synthetic media gets layered onto that on the content side of things. And so it's completely changed the game on the sophistication of those attacks based on the old hat kind of legacy platforms. And, again, like we found that almost 20% of leaders express very strong confidence in their ability to kind of detect your standard types of attacks and sentiments, but 80% have no idea how to remediate or understand a more sophisticated campaign, particularly if there's state actors involved. And that's why you need the latest and greatest technology to be able to actually understand what's happening in that space. And that is how do narratives actually propagate, accelerate? How do they harden into belief? And what do you do about that?
Blackbird AI, we often use the phrase narrative attack for one reason is that it focuses on the outcome. So, how are these narrative attacks? How do they affect financial markets and economic stability?
So one way to think about it is the capital markets have always been a perception-based engine. So markets move based on how people feel about a particular thing. So if you create like a false claim around things like liquidity or solvency or compliance or just something that the CEO said that he never said, maybe something that they did say but recontextualized or deepfaked, a perception can ripple through markets within hours. Suddenly you have investor confidence, shareholder confidence shifting before you even have the time to respond. And this just falls under this blanket of what we look at Blackbird all the time, which is perception manipulation. And there have been a lot of different estimates on how much this actually costs companies, but Gartner says a couple of years it's going to be $500 billion a year. Markets essentially put a price on trust. And when trust destabilizes, valuation also follows. Tactically, we've seen threat actors, short selling companies based on narratives that change perception around that company. And I guess just one other thing I would add is the reason this is even more effective today is prior to all of the apps that you can essentially trade stocks on today. You have to go through a broker. It used to be a whole process, right? But the new apps have onboarded by the millions new kind of more unsophisticated experimenters that can still trade the same markets. And where do they look? They look at different types of social media platforms to understand what's happening. So if you launch a successful narrative attack and look at things like even like Wall Street bets around like creating the push to drive a bunch of people to have a particular action in markets, you can drive price movements by harnessing people in masses using narratives and narrative attacks. And so being able to understand those dynamics, if you're not doing that in the financial markets, whether you're actually, NASDAQs of the world or just your individual company who wants to understand like which direction narrative might drive your market price, I mean, you're leaving a lot of risk out there to be potentially hit by one of these.
Companies aren't just faceless entities, they do have executives and people working at them. So, why and how have executives personally become targets of narrative attacks?
I mean, it's certainly the societal reasons, right? I mean, if you're going to have publicly traded companies post all the salaries and bonuses of their executives, and so there's just a general groundswell of aggravation around income inequality, right? And you can harness any kind of existing emotions and sentiments within a society to then turn that into a narrative attack, right? I think that's one thing, but just a threat actor being able to latch onto a company and also a CEO CEOs and company executives become the target number one when the company has done something wrong in the eyes of the public. And so it's very important to understand the groundswell around an organization or an entire industry for that matter. Something can happen, say, in the airline industry with one airline, impacts the entire airline industry if it's something that people get riled up about. So Blackbird thinks about executive protection by understanding very early signals that are looking like groundswell of sentiment or attack. And then that often is something that we'll work with the chief security officer or anyone who is looking at force posture, physical protection to understand when should we go from green to orange to red long before someone shows up in the lobby with a machine gun, shows up at the house on a CCTV camera system. You want to understand the groundswell well ahead of time, and that can elevate risk posture long before any other real world event signal.
What do executives, organizations, companies, governments, what do they underestimate about narrative risk?
I've talked to so many CEOs who are like, if we get hit by something like a narrative attack and we've done the wargaming around this, we expect to lose 25% of our market value. And I talked to a $20 billion pharmaceutical company that believes that. And so if you think about that, like, I mean, what else? If you look at the average cost of like a ransomware, malware, data exfiltration, still in the millions, maybe tens of millions. But what else is going to knock off $5 billion off company value? Or in the case of Bud Light some years ago, $20 billion off market cap in months, right? It's almost nothing. So I think the people who are out there the furthest in terms of thinking about what they need to be safeguarding their company, their shareholders, and when we talk about physical protection, their employees, their executives, they're no longer underestimating the need to understand where narrative attack's coming from, who's doing it, how to mitigate it. But it's still an emerging category. There's a lot of people who just wait too long to actually do something about it. And it's good to see a lot of proactive inbound in this category versus years ago. But I think to answer your question, a lot of people who aren't looking carefully drastically underestimate how costly and damaging a narrative attack can actually be. And there's a reason that, World Economic Forum still ranks it, the number two greatest problem, global risk, for 2026. So yes, awareness is rising, concern is rising, budgets for this are rising, but what has to evolve now is leadership actually thinking that this is a must-have versus waiting until something pretty bad happens. So it's a new discipline and it requires new infrastructure, new thinking. And luckily we're seeing real signs of that.
Wasim, thank you very much for sharing those insights. And thank you for watching this Blackbird AI LinkedIn Live. To learn more, I encourage you to visit the Blackbird AI blog. A link to the full report is pinned to the top of the blog, or you can just click that big RAV3N Report flag that shows up on the website. We hope to talk to you again soon. And until next time, I'm Dan Patterson. Thanks again for watching.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Wasim.